In audio production, reverb is a time-based effect designed to bring depth and dimension to a recording. But reverb isn't just limited to music production. We hear reverb all around us. Right now, you're hearing the direct sound of my voice as it reaches this microphone, but you're also hearing the indirect sound as it reflects off of walls and other surfaces in my room before reaching the microphone. If I create more space between me and the microphone, the indirect sound will become louder in relation to the direct sound, making the reverberation even more obvious. For thousands of years, humans have built structures specifically designed to harness the power of reverb to make sound behave in particular ways. In a concert hall, for example, the sound from the performer will move outward in every direction. Some of the energy will reach the audience directly, while some of the energy will bounce around the room first before reaching the audience. So, if you were sitting within the audience, you'll hear thousands of copies of the same sound, each with its own unique tonal quality based on the materials and surfaces that it interacted with before reaching your ears. The unique quality of the reverberation within any given space is a function of the size of the room, the height of the ceiling, and the construction materials throughout. Fine-tuning the sonic signature of a space like this can provide context to a listener of a film or a video game that contributes to the overall experience. Recording music in a large purpose-built studio can make a drum kit or a choir sound bigger and more powerful. It can be used to bring realism to an acoustic recording or to make larger-than-life electric guitar or vocal recordings. But don't worry, you don't have to have access to a $1 million facility to harness the power of reverb in your own work. Thanks to the methods that audio engineers have developed over the last century, you and I can use reverb in an instant. Not only that, but we have access to the most customizable reverbs that have ever existed at a fraction of the cost. Back in the early days of recording, if you wanted some reverb on your singer's voice, you didn't have many options. You would have had to use the reverb that already existed within the space. Perhaps you would have adjusted the distance between the microphone and the vocalist to balance the amount of reverb. This is what I demonstrated at the beginning of the video. The further the source is from the microphone, the quieter the direct sound will be in relation to the indirect or reverberant sound. At a certain point, the level of the reverberation at the microphone is equal in level to the direct sound. This is referred to as the critical distance. A big problem with these methods, though, is that you only have one chance to get it right. If you placed a microphone too far from the vocalist, you had too much reverb, and there's nothing you could do about it once the recording was printed to tape. That's a level of pressure that makes modern music producers like you and me nervous just thinking about it. Another option would have been to use more than one microphone. This is the idea behind room mics, which is a technique that's still commonly used today. However, before the invention of multi-track recording in the late 1940s, you still would have had to get it right before pressing the record button, but at least you would have had the opportunity to adjust a fader for the second microphone to control the blend of reverb, rather than telling your vocalist to take a step back. In the 1947 song Peg o' My Heart by the Harmonicats, we hear what is widely regarded as the first implementation of artificial reverb. Rather than using the natural reverberation within the studio, producer Bill Putnam Sr., the founder of Universal Audio, utilized a reverb chamber. More specifically, he placed a loudspeaker and a microphone in the studio's bathroom. The speaker played the dry signal, and the microphone captured the reverberant wet signal. You'll hear me use these terms throughout the video. Dry and wet. Dry signal refers to the sound before reverb is applied. Wet signal refers to the reverberation itself. Typically, both the dry and wet signals are mixed together to achieve the desired balance in the final mix. This was revolutionary, and it contributed to the huge success of the song, giving listeners a taste of artificial reverb for the first time in history. You can find a link to the song in the full post that's linked below. In the audio world, this innovation set off a chain of events that led to some studios building designated rooms to be used as reverb chambers. You don't need a designated chamber, though. Remember, the first reverb chamber was a bathroom. Let's look at how we can set up a reverb chamber in your studio. Pay close attention here, because the framework also applies to setting up modern reverb plugins in a mixing session. You route the dry signal from a microphone into a mixer or you record it. Then you use an aux send for routing the dry signal out of the mixer into a speaker within the chamber. Maybe you can use a stairwell or a bathroom for your chamber. Then you set up a microphone within the chamber that will capture the reverb that's being created by the signal playing from the speaker. The signal from the microphone will be routed to a separate channel so that it can be blended with the original dry signal. You may need to experiment with the placement of both the speaker and the microphone, as well as the blend between the dry and wet signals to get the desired sound. Again, this general setup is still used as the framework for setting up any reverb. You use an aux send to route the various dry signals to the reverb. This is called an effects send. Then the wet signal returns on a new channel called an effects return. Here's a recording before and after running through a chamber reverb that I set up right here in my stairwell. Okay, my stairwell reverb doesn't sound very good, but luckily modern technology is here to save the day. Today, you can use plugins like the Universal Audio Capital Chambers and Hitsville Reverb Chambers to send your own recordings through emulations of some of the most famous reverb chambers in history without stepping outside your studio. We'll get into how these plugins work later in the video. When using a reverb plugin, you don't need to route the dry signal out of the DAW. Instead, you simply create a new track and place a reverb plugin on that track. Then you can create a send to route the signal from the drum track over to the reverb track. You can use the effects send knob and the effects return fader to achieve the desired blend. Let's listen to how this reverb compares. All right, that's much better. You can find a link to a free trial of this plugin in the description below. As you can hear, the quality of the chamber can vary widely. Getting back to the story, dedicated reverb chambers were prohibitively expensive for most studios, and they weren't portable at all. The sound you get from a chamber is also dependent on the room, so if you wanted to change the sound, you would need to move the speaker, the mic, or the other objects within the room, and even then your options were pretty limited. But in the late 1930s and 1940s, another artificial reverb solution was born. Lawrence Hammond implemented the first spring reverb into the Hammond organ in order to give players a sound that more closely resembled the rich, reverberant sound of playing an organ within a church or a cathedral. A spring reverb operates on a completely different principle. Rather than creating reverb in a physical space, it creates a reverb-like sound mechanically in metal springs. A transducer is attached to one end of the springs, and that transducer is driven with the dry audio signal, which causes vibrations along the springs. On the other end of the springs, there's a pickup, which captures the wet signal. Vibrations in the springs reflect from one end to the other, creating a series of delays that blur together and mimic the reverberation within a room. By the late 1960s, this technology had advanced to the point where it could fit within a guitar amp, giving guitarists the opportunity to add reverb on the fly. Many guitar amps today still have reverb tanks. If you've ever wondered what that large rectangular box is within your guitar combo amp, that's the reverb tank. The sound of a spring reverb isn't hyper-realistic by any means, but it is iconic. It has a dark, spongy, and sort of bubbling quality that's mostly used as an effect rather than to synthesize an actual acoustic environment. Take a listen to this Universal Audio emulation of the AKG BX20. You can find a link to this plugin in the description below. A German company called EMT created the first plate reverb called the EMT 140. It was still pretty bulky, but much more affordable and portable than an actual reverb chamber. Not only that, but it offered a much different sound than you could get from a room or a spring reverb, and gave the engineer a bit more control. A plate reverb operates on a similar principle to a spring reverb, but rather than a spring, a transducer excites a large metal plate. And when I say large, I mean large. The EMT 140 was a huge box that contained an 8x4 foot plate that weighed more than 1/4 of a ton. Back in college, we had an EMT plate reverb, and it needed to be placed in the hall outside, partly because it was so bulky and partly because the noise or vibrations around the enclosure could end up in the return signal. A plate isn't quite as realistic as an actual acoustic space like a chamber, and they sound much brighter and smoother than a spring reverb. But they're still a go-to choice for all sorts of instruments when you want to add a luscious, shimmering effect. Listen to this vocal clip with the Universal Audio EMT 140 Classic Plate Reverberator plugin.
It's very clear our love is here to stay. It's very clear our love is here to stay.
Not only are plates useful on a single instrument, but they can also be used to create cohesion between several instruments. Listen to the difference that this pure plate reverb can make to bring these individual dry elements together into a virtual space. By the way, this plugin is available as a part of the Universal Audio Spark subscription package. You can learn more with the link below. Once we hit the age of digital audio in the late 1970s, things started to get even more interesting. Rather than using physical spaces or using mechanical devices, engineers began implementing digital algorithms that simulated physical spaces. In 1976, EMT came back with the first commercial digital reverb system called the EMT 250. Digital algorithmic reverbs use a series of digital delays and mathematical algorithms to create highly realistic reverbs. To many listeners, the first digital algorithmic reverbs may have sounded a little bit too perfect to the point where they were otherworldly. But it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, and it shaped the sound of music throughout the next 2 decades. To this day, the EMT 250 is considered to be one of the best sounding digital reverbs ever created. Listen to this clip of the UAD EMT 250 Classic Electronic Reverb plugin. In 1978, Lexicon, a company co-founded by the inventor of the EMT 250, Dr. Barry Blesser, released the Lexicon 224. It was similar to the EMT 250, but much more affordable. And as you can imagine, this made it possible for even more studios to start harnessing the power of digital reverb. This Lexicon 224 digital reverb plugin is also included in the Spark bundle. Take a listen. Fast forward to 1999, Sony releases their DRE S777 Convolution Reverb. Convolution reverbs are also digital, but they operate on a different principle than the algorithmic reverbs we covered previously. A convolution reverb works with 2 audio sources, the input signal and the impulse response. The input signal is the dry signal that you'll be adding reverb to, and the impulse response is a representation of the sonic character of a space and how it reacts to different frequencies. The impulse response is created by playing an impulse in a room, either a quick burst of sound or a frequency sweep, and recording the way that the room responds to that impulse, hence impulse response. That information is saved and then loaded into a convolution reverb, and through the process of cross-synthesis, the convolution reverb can apply those acoustic characteristics to any sound passing through it. This means that we can collect impulse responses from physical rooms and reverb units and load those IRs into a convolution reverb, essentially adding real spaces to your collection to use later on. This is a part of the secret behind all of the Universal Audio reverb plugins I've demonstrated throughout this video. They created these plugins using a proprietary mix of convolution reverb and algorithmic reverb called dynamic room modeling. This blend of convolution and algorithmic reverb faithfully recreates the original space while still allowing lots of flexibility and customization within the plugin. One of the best examples of this is the Ocean Way Studios reverb, which gives you access to the rooms at Ocean Way Recording, where endless classic records have been recorded, from Ray Charles to Radiohead to the Rolling Stones and so many more. Have a listen. Make sure to check out the links below to start using these plugins in your own mixes. Thank you to Universal Audio for sponsoring the video. Watch the video that's on your screen now to learn more about adding space and dimension to a mix. I'll see you over there.